So good morning and welcome to today's Maniac Talk. As always, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome one of our own here, who's going to talk about his life here for the last 35 years. Now, before I jump to that, I wanted to introduce, to talk about his short story to get everyone warmed up a little bit. The setting of this story is, as usual, in the great savannas of Africa. And I'm going to talk about the warthog. Some of you call it a hog, or this wild pig. Very distinct animal, actually. When you go out there in the bush, you can actually see it with the tusk, two pairs of tusks, stretching out. So these animals are in a crisis, and the crisis is about complaints that lions are eating most of them. So the leader decides to convene a meeting so that they can lay out a strategy. Okay. So in this meeting, you can imagine, and picture this. You are in this great African savannas, tall glass, scattered trees all around. It's a sunny day. It's not as gloomy as today. And but the meeting is so heated because they are worried. The lions are just almost finishing the stock, so they want to deal with it. And then you can imagine they are pointing fingers mainly directed to the leaders. So their leader decides that the way to deal with the menace is to go out and confront the lion. But in the meantime, they agree that all the other animals, the warthog, has to go on a hill, and then they have to cheer up as he confronts the lion. Okay? So it's a brave leader, actually. So he goes out there, and you can imagine this is a short, small animal, barely half a meter tall, and a huge lion. But he's going to go there and he's going to try to fight and deal with this situation. Then, upon coming very close to the lion, so the lion stands around and roars and goes after this guy, very furious. And that made the chief hog panic. He turned around and runs for his life, And then meanwhile, all the other animals on the hill are so scared that one of their owners, their chief, is going to go. And in fact, to the extent that they were even pointing fingers to those guys who suggest that their chief should go confront the lion. But anyway, this guy runs for his life, and then as the lions were closing in, he finds a tunnel, a small tunnel, and enters inside. Okay, in the tunnel, he tries to go deep in, and he realizes it's so dark he can't see. So he turns around and then walks backward towards the end. Meanwhile, the lion comes almost to the end, catching the guy, but he can't make it because the tunnel is quite small for the lion. So meanwhile, this guy keeps going backwards, and then at the end of this tunnel, there's a cobbler, the spitting cobbler. Okay, and guess who is on the hole looking outward? Is the lion. And the cobbler is behind. It's a spitting cobbler, so it spits out, okay, and the venom goes right into the eyes of the lion. So the lion wails and goes backward, running away. And then meanwhile, the warthog realizes that it's going to be eaten, so runs out also. And then you can actually picture this: the warthog is behind, and the lion is running away. Meanwhile, all the other animals sees this, and they start clapping around, saying, "Hey, my God, keep going!" So I guess the moral of this story is that because meanwhile, once the other animal sees this, they all calm down, tries to meet their guy, and hey, cheering him up. You are a great guy. You have dealt with this menace. And then because he's hammering, he's worried. They ask him, "How did you deal with it with the lion?" He says, it's because of that hole, that tunnel, Now, from that day, today, you go find this warthog, they always live in holes. So in my own culture, we say, those leaders who are very experienced, and there are many lessons in this story. They know where the holes are. Even though you are meeting where the lions are, they know where the holes are. So today, I'm actually honored that we have one of those great leaders here, Jim Irons, who's going to talk about, some of his experiences. And please help me welcome Jim Irons.
Thank you, Charles. I guess that's an appropriate story because I've stepped in a lot of the holes here at Goddard Space Flight Center and sprained my ankle a few times. So good afternoon and thank you for coming to this presentation. As Charles said, my name's Jim Irons. Beginning this week, I am now the Deputy Director for the Earth Sciences Division. And I haven't heard many of the previous speakers for this series discuss their roles as project scientists. So I thought in what will be mostly a stream of consciousness, talk a little bit about my experience as a project scientist for a major mission here at Goddard Space Flight Center. So, as background, I grew up in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio. While I was in high school, the river that bisects Cleveland, the Cuyahoga River, I lived in Cuyahoga County, caught fire. And so I was interested in math and science. I liked it and was leaning towards a technical career. And growing up, as the environmental movement began to take hold in this country, I thought that I could participate in this movement and help save the world. If that maybe was a little too ambitious, at least make a contribution. So one of the events that I encountered in my youth was this fire that occurred in 1969, and I said, well, maybe we have a problem here. Turns out this picture, which I think is the one that appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1969, was actually taken in 1952. 1969 fire was not the first one in the Cuyahoga River. The first recorded one was in the 1890s. There were a series of river fires since the 1890s, not all that frequent, but they occurred. And up until the 1960s, that wasn't seen as a bad thing. It meant that the steel mills were working. My father had, out of high school, had worked in the steel mills in Pittsburgh. I lived downwind from a Ford plant, which I could often, the sulfur dioxide was often very apparent. And most people would say, that's great, that smells like money. We're working, people are working. But in the 60s, there began to be an awareness of what we were doing as a nation to our environment, and this was one of the iconic events of the environmental movement, was this fire. So I went off to Penn State to further my education. There was a new major there called Environmental Resources Management, and it was designed to teach people to write environmental impact statements. The graduates were, the intent was to create graduates who would go off and have the broad-based background in science and economics and sociology and all those good things, and could write cogent environmental impact statements. While I was at Penn State, it turned out that my father had moved to Cleveland from Pittsburgh, actually from Penn State, to work for the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics at Lewis Field in Cleveland, where he built some of the first full-scale wind tunnels. And he still had a few connections there into the 70s, and basically encouraged me to apply for a summer job at Lewis Research Center. I couldn't find a picture of Lewis. It's now called Glenn Research Center after John Glenn. Glenn Research Center at Lewis Field, but back in 1975, it was the Lewis Research Center. And while I was there, I was assigned to a branch that was conducting research on the remote sensing of water quality in the Great Lakes. And they were flying on a World War II surplus C-47, a multispectral scanner instrument, airborne multispectral scanner from the ERIM in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And my job, this isn't me, but my job was to return to the, could be me, because part of my job those 2 summers were to return to the Cuyahoga River when it wasn't on fire and collect water samples off the shores of the Cuyahoga River. Fortunately, I'll go back to my hometown. Cleveland's recovered a bit. I used to drive down to an area called the Flats, where the sulfur dioxide was so bad I could barely breathe, and drive into a Coast Guard station that was at the mouth of the Cuyahoga, and a coastie would take me out on a boat, and I'd have vials and samples and a Secchi disc and turbulence meter and make measurements, sometimes while the airplane was flying over with the multispectral scanner. So when I work now with the Ocean Ecology Lab here, I said I have experience working with a Secchi disc. I know what that is. For those of you who don't, it's a disc. Its alternate quarters are painted black and white. You lower it into the water. You determine the depth to which you can see the Secchi disc and record that as an indicator of water quality. People still do that. They still use Secchi discs. But my joke, and it wasn't not really a joke, is that for this job we only needed a very short rope because we didn't have to go down very deep before we'd lose it. Fortunately, both Cleveland and the Cuyahoga River have recovered. The Flats now contains hotels and restaurants and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is right across the dock from the Coast Guard station I used to drive down to. So it's changed a lot. But when I got back to school after 1975, summer of 75 into my senior year, I began to realize that I wasn't marketable. Environmental impact statements were being written by engineering consulting firms. And for some reason, they appeared to favor engineers when they hired people, and not these people from the new major I worked at Penn State. And so I was faced with the daunting prospect of either selling life insurance, which didn't really appeal to me, or returning home to my parents' house, which appealed to me less. Unlike kids today. So I began to look for an assistantship in almost anything that had to deal with my major, and I stumbled across the Penn State Office of Remote Sensing of Earth Resources. And this was an interdepartmental organization that was co-directed by Dr. Gary Peterson in the agronomy department, and George McMurtry in the electrical engineering department. And just as an aside, George McMurtry's brother was the pilot for the Boeing, 747 that carried the shuttle on some of the test flights of the Enterprise shuttle. So he had a connection to NASA. See, it's a long story. I'll try to make it short. I went and met with Dr. Peterson. My major was in the Department of Agronomy. And I said, you know, I'm looking for an assistantship. He said, well, thank you very much for your interest, but I don't have any. And so it was getting to be about April or May of my senior year. Turns out that I played rugby for a little while at Penn State, and one of my teammates was named Fred Borden. And he got injured a lot, and his father was a faculty member at Penn State who happened to work in Orser. And I had a car, and I took him from the hospital to his home on a number of occasions, and had the opportunity to talk to his father. And come springtime, Gary went to Dr. Borden, and who was Darrell Williams' advisor, and said, somebody turned down an assistantship do you know any students who would be interested? He had forgotten all about me. And Dr. Borden said, yeah, I know this kid who my son knows. And Gary called me. He said, I remember you were interested in an assistantship. Are you still interested? I said, yes. So I can give you 2 weeks to decide. And I said, no, I'll take it, please. And so I got an assistantship to Penn State and became a soil scientist because that was Dr. Peterson's background. So I majored in agronomy and soil science, graduated with an MS in agronomy. My first semester of my master's program, we were actually in a quarter system there, so the first quarter, 10 weeks. Gary, the summer or the spring before, had asked me if I wanted to go to Johnson Space Center and learn about a program called the Large Area Crop Inventory Experiment. And I said, sure, what do I know? So I drove down. So my first semester, I went and registered for a research credit at Penn State. I drove to Houston. I had spent the summer at Lewis, and I had called up the director of the Lacey, the crop inventory experiment, Bob McDonald, and he said, yeah, come on down. So I drove to Houston. I walked into his office, and Dr. McDonald introduced me to, or Mr. McDonald, actually, he didn't have a PhD, introduced me to a fellow named Mickey Trishell, said he's going to be your boss for the next 10 weeks. And it was there that I learned about land cover mapping, agricultural mapping, and the uses of large quantities of Landsat data to try to get a global inventory of the acreage planted in wheat. It's also where I met Mr. McDonald's deputy, Dr. Forrest Hall. So I ran into him for the first time, working 10 weeks in Houston. And that was a good experience. I really started out pretty, well, I was uneducated in remote sensing, highly uneducated, and began to catch on a little bit during those 10 weeks. After I got my master's degree, I was fortunate in that Goddard Space Flight Center had hired another graduate of ORSER. His name was Darrell Williams. He's right there. He came down to Penn State to recruit some new hires. At that time, for the only time in my tenure at Goddard Space Flight Center, Goddard Earth Sciences was recruiting people with master's degrees to come work. Ever since, you pretty much need a PhD to come work here in the civil service in the earth sciences or any of the sciences. But at that time, there was a group of us that were hired to work here at Goddard Space Flight Center with master's degree. And unfortunately, that didn't turn out very well because I was there. Steve Wharton had a master's degree. Darrell Williams had a master's degree. Brian Markham's in this picture. He had a master's degree. Dave Toll, Ed Masuoka, Brent Holben. So obviously, that crew didn't work out too well here at Goddard. But anyhow, you might recognize this is my first branch. The branch head was Charlie Schnetzler. There's Dr. Tucker, Ed Masuoka, Steve Wharton, whom Brian's back there, Brian, Darrell, Chris Justice. So it was a pretty good group to start working with, particularly for somebody who was pretty clueless as to the process of conducting research and capturing funding in a research institution like Goddard. But as we progressed in our careers in this branch, some people suggested that we wouldn't get much further without further education. So a number of us, including Darrell and Steve and myself, took part in the Goddard part-time graduate study program. It only took me 7 years, but I worked part-time, or I worked full-time, went part-time to the University of Maryland in the agronomy department, and I ended up with a PhD in 1993. During that era, During that time, I worked on a airborne instrument called the Advanced Solid State Array Spectroradiometer. It was an imaging spectrometer from the visible through the near infrared. We operated it in a manner, we flew over a site and we were able to point it forward, nadir, and aft as we flew over a site, typically aboard the NASA C-130, either from Ames or from Wallops. And we collected multi-angle images of terrestrial land cover, primarily vegetation. This is a picture of ASAS, with I think Phil Dabney still has somewhere in this building. These are images from an experiment in Africa called HAPEX Sahel. You can see the bright anti-solar images going back to the darker images at nadir, and then the forward scattering images that way. I think there were 20-some field campaigns we participated in. First ISIL-SCIP field campaign. I know that's pixelated. It was the only electronic version I could find. In Kansas, the Boreal Ecosystem and Atmosphere Study in Canada. And what success we accomplished with ASAS is owed primarily to this guy who kept that thing running through these field campaigns. I think in 20-some deployments, we only missed successful collection of data once, and that wasn't even for the whole campaign. So it was a temperamental instrument too. My career as I worked 28 years in the Biospheric Sciences branch as a staff scientist. In 2007, Bill Lau asked if I would serve as his deputy lab chief for the Lab for Atmospheres. I thought it was quite remarkable that Bill would ask a soil scientist to serve as a deputy director for a Lab for Atmospheres. So I saw it as an opportunity to expand my horizons a little bit. I really appreciate Bill taking me under his wing for those years. It was great to work with him, and I did try to learn a lot about atmospheric sciences. But at the end of 2013, Dave Adamek retired as the deputy director for hydrospheric and biospheric sciences, so I applied for that position and was honored to be selected. And then last month, or this month, our acting director for Earth Sciences, Piers Sellers, created another position, deputy director, and I applied and accepted that, and my official start day was Sunday. So this is my first week in that job. So I went 28 years, 7 years, 1 year. I hope it's not a trend, or I'll be gone next week to someplace else. Trouble holding the job. But let me move on to Landsat. So the Landsat program goes back to 1972. The launch of Landsat 1, it was the year I graduated high school, right after the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. And it was the first, at least civilian satellite that was designed to collect images of the global land surface. And since 1972, there's always been at least one Landsat satellite in operation. This shows the series. NASA Goddard Space Flight Center managed the development and launch of all of those satellites, with the exception of Landsat 6, which failed to achieve orbit when it was launched in 1993. So we've been responsible for all the successful Landsat satellites. However, the program has enjoyed a rather convoluted programmatic history. It started at NASA as this doesn't show up very well, does it? Anyhow, blue is NASA. And Landsats 1 through 3 started as experimental, primarily research systems for NASA, and we were responsible for building and for operating the satellites. Our partner in the Landsat program, the U.S. Geological Survey and the Department of the Interior, has always been responsible for archiving and distributing Landsat data from the beginning. But in the late 70s, the Landsat satellites were so successful that there was a decision or an inclination to declare those satellites operational. NASA said we don't do operational missions, so the program was transferred to NOAA for operations, and then there was a law passed that said, well, this is not an inherently government function to operate these kinds of operational satellites. And so there was a period of time where the operations of Landsat 4 and Landsat 5 were transferred to the private sector. And the consequence of that was that the cost for Landsat Data grew exponentially by a couple orders of magnitude. In 1992, however, there was a law passed, and that law said that this attempt to commercialize Landsat operations hasn't gone well. So we're going to return responsibility for building Landsat 7 to the government. And initially, responsibility for program management was assigned to a partnership between NASA and the Department of the Interior, the Department of Defense, meaning the Air Force. And Darrell Williams, who was the head of the Biospheric Sciences branch at that time, was designated the NASA project scientist. And he had a branch meeting. He said, look, you know, Landsat's coming back to the government. I'm the project scientist. You know, I might be a little distracted from my branch head duties. And after that meeting, I came up to him and I said, hey, you know, if you want help with the Landsat, I'd be like to help. I have some background. He said, yeah, I need a deputy. You're it. So that was before GOBS ads, I guess, were put out. There was a lot of initial turmoil. Department of Defense, the Air Force backed out of the program. NASA took over the contract for Landsat 7 development from the Department of Defense. We initially worked with NOAA and USGS. NOAA dropped out, and by 1999, 2000, it had become a NASA-USGS partnership with NASA responsible for developing and launching the observatory, and with USGS taking over lead responsibility for mission operations, which they continue to do today from a mission operations center in Building 32. So a good day was April 15th, 1999, when we launched Landsat 7 from Vandenberg Air Force Base, and it's been in operation ever since. The Land Remote Sensing Policy Act in '92 also directed Landsat Program Management to plan for a follow-on mission or follow-on missions. It laid out 4 options how to do that, but it made a statement that there's a preference for returning the Landsat program to the private sector. And so how many people here remember the Easton Workshop? Remember the Easton Workshop? It was like the proto-decadal survey. There were a series of workshops led by Shelby Tilford. The final one was held in Easton, Maryland. The result was a mission scenario for the Earth Sciences Enterprise. And part of that scenario was that NASA was going to examine private sector initiatives for follow-on missions for Landsat 7. And as a result, the Associate Administrator for Earth Science at that time, Ghassem Asrar, directed Stennis Space Center, our lead NASA Center for Commercialization, to formulate a data buy strategy for this follow-on mission designated EOS-1, while Goddard was given the task of costing a government-built system as a reference strategy. And at that time, I was assigned the responsibility of developing that reference case. I presented the reference case at NASA headquarters on March of 1999 with a budget range of $365 to $458 million. For first quarter launch date. And this is the funniest part. At that time, we estimated the launch vehicle would cost between $25 and $35 million. So if you know about launch costs today, you know that was a slight underestimate. However, there was an instrument cost range given for between 143 and 173 million, developed by our RAO office here at Goddard. And I just had my rear end chewed out in my presentation by Pierre Morel at NASA headquarters, who said, we can build this instrument for $20 million. And you know, it was irresponsible for me to come to NASA headquarters to present such an outrageous cost. Well, it ended, the OLI instrument, Operational Land Imager, currently on Landsat 8 costs about $150 million. So I feel a little bit vindicated but it was another hole I stepped in. Like leadership by Stennis basically didn't work out all that well. In 2000, there was a formulation authorization document from Dr. Oswar that said the formulation would be led from NASA headquarters. And I was given the science lead for that formulation here at Goddard. Ultimately, there was a project manager, Doug McQuistion, from Goddard, assigned to the formulation, and things didn't really get rolling until he assumed that responsibility. And at that time, I personally made a sincere effort to try to make a data buy work. I thought it was the only way we were going to move forward. Politically at that time, I put my heart and soul into making it, trying to make it work. I worked with a group to develop a data specification. Jeff Masick helped out on that a lot. Other people, Brian Markham, others. And we released a specification that was followed up by formulation phase contracts to two companies, Resource 21 and Digital Globe. For $5 million, they were supposed to develop concepts and present them in preliminary design reviews. They did that within their 9 months, and NASA released an implementation phase RFP at the beginning of 2003. Proposals were received. They were evaluated through a source evaluation board, and ultimately, Dr. Oswar, in what I considered a fairly courageous decision, decided not to accept the proposals because the government did not receive the cost savings that were imagined by this approach. And it was basically going to cost the government about the same as much as the reference case that we had developed back in 1999. So the decision was made not to select those proposals and to start over. The Executive Office of the President formed a multi-agency working group to come up with a path forward for a follow-on mission. That group came up with the idea of putting a Landsat sensor on NPOs, on the NPOs platforms. And the direction to NASA came up in a memo in 2004 from Dr. Marburger, and basically said, fly a Landsat sensor on NPOs. Well, here at Goddard, we didn't think that was a great idea. We were first already aware of the programmatic difficulties that were being encountered in the NPOs program. And second of all, there wasn't really it wasn't a good platform for a higher resolution sensor. There was too much vibration. Wasn't a lot of room in the payload, and it just wasn't working out. And I can say that I did everything in my limited powers to really push back on this idea. It wasn't well conceived. And finally, in late 2005, that realization was reached in the decision-making levels of government that this idea of flying Landsat on NPOs was a bad idea. And on December 23rd, 2005, I got an early Christmas present when this memo was released that said, go build a free flyer. This was the strategy that I think was appropriate for the program from the beginning. And we commenced to build Landsat what is now called Landsat 8. We initially called it the Landsat Data Continuity Mission, going back to the data buy effort. It was developed through an interagency partnership with NASA and the U.S. Geological Survey. NASA built and launched the observatory. The U.S. Geological Survey built the ground system and is now responsible for satellite operations from Amok and Building 14. So we launched on February 11, 2013 from Vandenberg. On-orbit commissioning was completed by the end of May, and USGS assumed responsibility then. Payload consists of 2 sensors. One's called the Operational Land Imager. It was built under contract to NASA by Ball Aerospace and Technology Corporation, Ball, in Boulder, Colorado, and a thermal infrared sensor that was built here at Goddard. So what was my role in this whole extended 14-year period of mission formulation and development? Well, I think the role for any project scientist is to ensure the scientific integrity of a mission. And what that means and how you do that is subject to interpretation. Project scientist is considered a full associate of the project manager here at Goddard. It means we're at the same level on the org chart as a project manager, but in reality, the project manager has responsibility for cost, schedule, and performance and holds the budget. So as a project scientist here at Goddard, I've found that my real role was to try to influence by persuasion and logic, good looks, cajoling, you know, whatever it took. But this is really leadership, at least in my case, an attempt at leadership by influence, because there is no real budgetary authority. And in fact, project scientists are not even considered supervisors, you know, in the performance description system. So this is an area where it works best if you develop good working relationships with the people who are responsible for developing and implementing the mission. I was fortunate, well, I found the task daunting because first of all, there is a real history of prominent Landsat project scientists going back to Bill Nordberg, for which the Nordberg Award is named for, Stan Fredden, Vince Solomonson, and Daryl Williams, and these guys are really, you know, in our field, they're legends. Don't get a big head, Daryl. Daryl's but they're really legends in the field, I think, and I found them very big shoes to fill. But on the other hand, they were great role models. So I learned a lot watching Vince Solomonson and his deputy for Landsat 4 and 5, Daryl Williams, and then having the great opportunity to work for Daryl as his deputy for Landsat 7. I was also very fortunate to work with a sequence of project managers. One thing I'm not perfectly comfortable with at Goddard Space Flight Center is that project managers will sometimes move from project to project. And the good ones get put on projects in trouble, and then when they straighten it out, they're kind of moved on to the next one. But Doug took us through the data buy period. Then Bill Oakes took over, and he really carried this program on his back for a number of years. And he did such a good job that he was pulled off a Landsat LDCM and made the project manager for a little project called the James Webb Space Telescope. You might have heard of it. Phil Sablehouse came over from JWST for a couple years until he retired. And then Ken Schweer, who had just launched the NPP mission, SUMI NPP, came over to finish up the project and get us launched. And it was a real, I was very fortunate to work with those project managers because they were engaged project scientists. They engaged Code 610 in the process of developing and launching this mission. In addition to the Project Science Office with Bruce Cook and the instrument scientist Phil Dabney, who I knew from my ASAS days, and earlier before Bruce, Jeff Masick, they accepted Brian Markham in a position that is normally filled by somebody from Code 500. And he became the lead for calibration and validation. We had an active education and public outreach team led first by Anita Davis and then Holly Rebeck and now by Ginger Butcher. They took an employee from 610, Jeff Petaldy, and sent him out to Ball Aerospace to be the on-site rep for the development of the operational land imager. That's really extraordinary, I think, that we had somebody with a science perspective embedded into our contractor. And then in TIERS instrument management, initially led by Kathy Richardson and finished up by Betsy Forbach, they adopted a number of our support contractors, Matt Montanaro in particular. Dennis Reuter was the instrument scientist for TIERS and brought them into the project. And I think that's one of the reasons the project was successful, in that the project managers I had the privilege of working with would recognize and embed talent from the Science Directorate, from the Earth Sciences Division, into the project. One thing I'm particularly proud of is that, going back to Associate Administrator Oswald, despite a mandate for data continuity, the NASA was told we were not going to fly a thermal infrared sensor on the next Landsat. It was believed that the return on investment of flying a thermal sensor did not justify the cost. There were reasons for that belief, in that there weren't a lot of people using thermal data before Landsat 7. But when we launched Landsat 7, under Darrell's leadership, we developed a systematic approach for collecting data across the globe, and we improved calibration and validation. And all of a sudden, thermal data became available and it became useful because it was well calibrated. And people began to use that data to estimate evapotranspiration rates for water resources management. And it turns out the water resources management community is vocal and proactive, and they began a campaign to restore a thermal imaging capability to the Landsat Data Continuity mission. And it turned out, ultimately, that effort, that advocacy, was successful. And one of the things I'm proudest of is, to the degree to which I was able, I tried to help that advocacy. Probably sometimes stepping in a few holes that I wasn't supposed to step in along the way. Associate Administrator Weiler came to Goddard in 2008 and said, well, it's really late, but can you add a thermal instrument to the Landsat payload? And Goddard said yes. Remarkably, because the time, and he said, can you do it without delaying launch? Goddard said, yeah, we think so. And we did. I mean, Goddard came together. It was a struggle. Kathy Richardson's performance as instrument manager was really magnificent. And they delivered this thermal instrument in 43 months, when normally at least 48 months. And probably longer to develop an instrument like this. One of the things I'm also proud of is that we have excellent interagency cooperation between NASA and the U.S. Geological Survey, fostered through our working relationships going back all the way to Landsat 1, but becoming particularly improved as we work to develop Landsat 7 and return its operation to the government. I've worked to try to foster those good working relationships, establish good connections there with our partner agency. One of those indications, I think, is that my counterpart at USGS Aero Center in Sioux Falls, Tom Loveland, invited me to co-chair a Landsat science team, which is funded by the USGS. So he was graciously incorporated NASA project scientist into that science team, and he didn't have to do that. So that data archive is out at AROS. During the development of Landsat 8, USGS made a decision to distribute Landsat data for free. Prior to 2008, they had sold Landsat scenes for $600 per scene. Basically, in 2008, they decided to make that free. The result was that their annual rate of scene distribution increased from about 20 to 25,000 scenes per year to now 3 million scenes per year. So I think this has brought, finally brought a full return on investment to the taxpayers' investment in the Landsat program, going back 42 years. The result of that has been a revolution in the development of computing capacities and methodologies to analyze Landsat data over long periods of time. And that's really why we collect data, Landsat data, is to observe and understand land cover and land use change over time. These are images provided by Curtis Wilcox at Boston University. What he does is take, this is an area in Massachusetts. What he does is stack basically Landsat data going back to 1984, co-register it on top, and then he creates a database for every pixel. And he throws out those pixels that are cloud covered in his analyses, and he tracks the trajectory of change in spectral space over time for every one of those pixels. And in doing that, when he observes an abrupt disruption in that trajectory, he's able to determine that land cover change has occurred at that location. In addition, with the information, he's not only able to, he and his colleagues at Boston, are not only able to identify change, but they're able to identify the type of land cover that was before and after that change occurred. And so all across the world now, having access to free data has allowed investigators and analysts to develop new methodologies for tracking change with Landsat data over long periods of time and over large areas. And in fact, now you can go to google.org through a program called Time Lapse. They've downloaded the entire Landsat archive. You can go to any location on the Earth and you can get a time-lapse series of images for your hometown or any place you're interested in studying. Amongst the shoulders I'm standing on are the Project Science staff here at Goddard that have worked on Landsat along with me for years now. And if I forgot anybody, I apologize, but I wanted to ensure that you all realize that it's a group effort, it's a team effort. It's a privilege to work here at Goddard Space Flight Center with such hardworking and dedicated individuals. And that's really been the best part of my 35-year career here at Goddard is the opportunity to do so. I've worked with them for a long time because the center has worked with the Landsat program for a long time. And we've persisted in our devotion towards creating a quality program of societal benefit and societal consequence. LDCM, or now Landsat 8, is a triumph for Goddard, I think, because we have the institutional memory, we have great leadership, we have a culture of failure is not an option, it's more than a catchphrase here. We have great people. Landsat, we enjoyed great intra-directorate cooperation, intra-agency cooperation. We persisted, and it's an important mission. So I think all those things contributed to the success. What's next? The president directed NASA to study, open up the trade space to all possibilities for considering a follow-on mission, including a data buy. There was a architecture study team assembled that was interagency and intercenter. Included Jeff Masick and Del Genstrom, Phil Dabney, and Evan Webb here from Goddard. They reported out to NASA headquarters at the end of the summer or the middle of the summer, and we're still standing by to determine what the NASA strategy will be on the way forward. And this whole process, to me, has been deja vu all over again, because we are once again struggling to determine what's the best way forward for a really important program. And it's a little bit frustrating, but have some understanding that that's just part of the process of working in an imperfect democracy. Unfortunately, nobody made me king. We'd be doing we'd be doing another free flyer if we were. We don't have an appropriations bill yet for fiscal year 15. The appropriations bill, or the version that came out of the Senate earlier in the summer, it said that NASA should build and launch a follow-on to Landsat 8 that's basically a clone, and it shouldn't cost any more than $650 million, including the launch. NASA came back through the Executive Office of the President and basically said $650 million isn't enough. Thank you. So we don't have a bill yet. Hope we get some direction for a follow-on mission if an appropriations bill is passed for fiscal year 15, and we will see. Points I wanted to make is, first of all, it's a privilege to work here at Goddard. I work with, throughout my career, in all of my jobs, I've worked with great people who have inspired me to try to do my best. I think my greatest contribution has been through participation in the Landsat program. I will try to continue to make some contributions in my new position. We'll see how that goes. But a couple things to think about through my experience one is, what are the appropriate roles for government and private industry with respect to Earth observations from space? I just saw an article in Space News this week where a bill is being passed or is being proposed in Congress for commercial weather satellite operations and for the government to support that. So this, throughout the Landsat program, through LDCM, and now on to follow-on missions, there's been consideration of, well, shouldn't these kinds of systems be operated by the private sector rather than the public? I'm not going to attempt to answer these, by the way. Another thought for your consideration is, what is the appropriate role for NASA with respect to sustained observations? Because Landsat has been cursed by being labeled at NASA as an operational mission. And NASA has said, we don't do operational missions. Please take Landsat away and let some other agency do it. And the legislature continually waits until there's a crisis. We're faced with the failure of a Landsat satellite, or at least the aging of a Landsat satellite, and has said, well, NASA, you go do it again and eat it out of your budget. And associate administrators get upset by that. So we're again, as we move forward, facing those kinds of questions as we move forward, both in the Landsat program and other of our Earth observations programs. So thank you for your attention.
So some quick questions or comments, please.
Yeah, Dave.
Persistence pays off. We finally got a clear day over the peninsula, September 29th.
Good. That was for a Landsat, and Landsat was going over. Yeah, good. That's always good. Any other questions? Yes, Hank.
What is the difference between a $20 million estimate on an instrument and $150 million?
$130 million. Well, I don't think we can build a sensor capable of collecting calibrated data over 180 kilometer swath from the visible through the thermal or even through the shortwave infrared for $20 million. It's a matter of what you are willing to accept for your data. And we've had a mandate, at least for Landsat 8, of data continuity. And now there's a lot of active debate is, do you really need data that good? Do you really need it for all those spectral bands? Can you do some of the same science, some of the same resource management with data from other systems? And now we are faced by a constellation of commercial systems that are collecting land imagery from space, typically only through the near infrared, and typically with much smaller swath widths. And we haven't really determined whether the degree which we're willing to accept that as a data stream for the purposes to which the Landsat program has been intended. Yeah, Daryl.
Also, why don't you talk about the history book?
Sure. Daryl asked me to mention that a group of us, initiated by Daryl, are working on a, this group, and I'm now part of it, have collected oral histories from people who've worked on Landsat through the years, beginning with Landsat 1, and we're now in the process of struggling through the writing of a history book, which looks like it will be published by the American Society of Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing. So we're trying to wring the editing out of chapters as we speak. Yes?
Okay, last one, yeah.
Okay.
I see that you've really kept the continuity in people for 40 years on Landsat. So there, do you have a specific program to continue to keep your knowledge rolling into the next generation?
Yeah, I mean, I have. So we have both hired and had worked as deputy project scientists and as other people working on calibration and validation to try to sustain the corporate knowledge beyond my retirement, Daryl's retirement, Brian Markham's retirement. And so, yeah, I mean, I mentioned some of the names of the people who have been working continue to work on the program as we consider a sustained land imaging program. And I think those people are gaining the experience and have gained the experience. I mean, I've worked with Jeff Masek now for a number of years on Landsat, and I've said that he's had an opportunity to learn from my mistakes, and he got a great education doing so.
Okay, with that, let's give Jim one more final.
Thank you.